You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
We have our first guest, and I want to thank him very much. Pete O'Brien is with the London Center for Policy Research. He's a former retired Navy captain, and he's joining us to discuss a lot of the events that are unfolding in Ukraine, some significant things that we need to discuss, and I welcome you to the program. It's great to have you. I'm Brett Rappaport, and my co-host John Rappaport is with us. Welcome, Pete.
Well, thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Well, terrific. Unfortunately, it's just a tragedy what we saw happen earlier this morning with the, let's just call it a downed Malaysian Airliner, which could have been down for many reasons, but it appears to have been shot down or possibly clipped by a missile to bring it down. It may have possibly crash-landed. Of course, these are things that will be found out, hopefully, as the investigation unfolds, if there's some level of cooperation. But, Pete, the bigger question here is the conflict that we find the world, as members of the world community. We are watching a very interesting civil war unfold where a lot of outside influences are becoming involved, whether it be politically or through the providing of possible forces, possible weapons, and other types of support. And this is the kind of incidents that could really flare this region into something much bigger. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, the obvious, for those history buffs among your audience, the obvious analogous situation that comes to mind is China back in 1931, the Mukden incident, where, for those who don't quite remember it, the Japanese army fabricated an incident in which there was an attack against, ostensibly, there was an attack against Japanese personnel in Manchuria, and the Japanese responded to protect their interests. And, of course, they had fabricated the entire thing, and they used it as a justification for a vast range of actions, which led to basically the seizing of Manchuria. So, I mean, if you want to let your mind kind of wander and think what's in the realm of the possible, I mean, these kind of things have happened before. So, then that leads you to some interesting questions as to exactly who would have shot down the aircraft and how they would have gone about it, et cetera.
Well, that's absolutely correct, Pete. I'm glad that you brought that up because we forget things like that in history. Of course, those of us who still read these books all the time are still up on it. And just to remind people that incident with the Japanese led to an extremely high level of civilian loss on the part of the Chinese. It was horrific what happened. Yes. And hopefully we never see something like that happen again. But I think you're absolutely correct. You're in a situation where who can you trust at this point? I mean, it seems everybody has an agenda. You have a lot of influence coming from Russia. You have American influence. You have European influence. You have all the factions within Ukraine and all the things that we're not even thinking about. So everything, you can't just take anything off the list of possibilities.
Right.
And that's why I saw a report that the separatists and the TPR had found the black box, and it's believed that they're going to send it off to Moscow. Now, I would call for that to be sent to a reliable international source that's used to these types of investigations, so no one could blame, well, the Americans are trying to do this, or the Europeans are trying to do that, or the Russians are trying to, hide something. Let's get a trustworthy source. Let's allow investigation teams to come onto the ground and properly look at this, but I suspect that that's not going to happen.
Well, right, and of course, the other side of it, too, is not to make light of the technology, but I'm not certain that the black box or the cockpit voice recorder. There's two separate boxes, as you
mm-hmm. know.
There's a digital data recorder that records the specifics of what the airplane's doing and throttle inputs, et cetera, and then there's a voice recorder for the cockpit. I'm not sure they're going to show anything of great note, except that all of a sudden the airplane suffers a catastrophic failure when it gets hit by a missile. I think it's fairly evident, given the number of reports that have now come out, that there's something to the story that they get hit by a missile. So the real question is not what happened on the airplane. We know what happened on the airplane. That's a horror, but the airplane gets hit by a missile, it's going to crash. And if you look, by the way, at some of the simple geography, if you take a flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, you draw a great circle route, which is roughly what they're going to be following. I don't know whether they were, in fact, flying a great circle route or flying something, they were under close control. But that route passes you essentially down a corridor that runs roughly along the northern Ukrainian border if you had straightened it out. And so if you're within 20 miles or so on either side of that line, then you're going to find that, that's where the airplane should have been. The question is why was it shot down? And you get to there's a very short list of what's possible for why the missile would leave the launcher. And obviously it could have just been a catastrophic mistake. Somebody mistook it for, let us assume that, for example, the missile was in fact launched from a pro-Russian separatist unit, and they thought they were firing at a Ukrainian airplane. Now, given that the airplane is flying straight and level at 35,000 feet, and assuming again that it was squawking at the normal technical mode 1, 2, and 3 IFS, information friend and fro, which are used to help track the airplane by air traffic controllers, they would have seen that it has labeled itself as an airliner, which of course can be a deception. If someone is in the middle of a war, you engage in those kind of deceptions. So somebody could have fired at the airplane because they thought that they were shooting at a Ukrainian aircraft, Ukrainian Air Force aircraft.
This whole thing, Pete, is very scary because you just pointed out the possibilities of both misdirection, the game of misdirection, if you will, as well as the general challenge with the fog of war.
Right.
Kids are going to, women and children in hospitals. I mean, remember during the war in Clinton's era in Serbia, we accidentally blew up a Chinese embassy, or maybe it wasn't an accident.
Right. Right.
We really will never know, will we? And so this is what I worry about is let's chalk it up because we don't know enough yet. So for now, let's call it the fog of war. The scary thing is here, one of two things could happen. These could become catalytic events that could lead to a much wider, broader conflagration where, as you know, once you get a certain level of geopolitical machismo, it's very difficult to back down from. Or it could be the call for the sober adults in the room to step in, as Brett just suggested, with a third party, for example, to study the black box with representatives from Russia, from Poland, from the U.S., from Germany, etc. So the question here is what's the next step from your perspective to make something like that happen, and can that be done with the president off on another long vacation? Will Europe pick up the reins, or do we really need the president to get back to the White House and think about what's happening in the world?
I think that there is the simple answer to that. Of course, Europe could pick up the reins. It's in the realm of the possible. It's just not in the realm of the probable. There's so much on the table for Europe from an economic perspective and a political perspective to simply turn a blind eye to everything that's going on in the Ukraine. We're talking about it's something on the order of 30 some odd billion dollars worth of natural gas, plus I think it's 3.5 million barrels of oil a day is coming out of Russia into Europe through Ukraine. So from a perspective, it's not. I mean, that's not just simple money. That's a whole standard of living issue. If you start to choke that off, Europe is in a very bad way very quickly, and from both an economic perspective and a political perspective. So I'd have a hard time thinking that all of a sudden Europe is going to stand up and show some spine and say, "Damn it, we need an international team on this, and we're not taking no for an answer." I just don't see that happening. So you really get around to is, if you want something to happen, this is the great opportunity for the outside, for the West, for the United States to stand up and say, "Okay, you now have gone too far. You need to stop, and we're going to start with, we're going to have an international investigation on this thing, and until such time as that's complete, we want a complete ceasefire, and we're going to insist upon it, and we're going to pull out all the stops, and we're going to have third-party embargoes. No one trades with Russia. No one trades with Ukraine. No one trades with anybody. We're shutting you guys all down, until we get the ceasefire, until we get an international team to go in there and start to address first this problem, and then later the whole general problem of this war." Now, the president is the only guy, I think, from a positional perspective, that is to say, the office of the president, is the only one right now with anything approaching the credibility to do that kind of thing. Could this president do it? I mean, he could. Am I expecting it? No.
Yeah, sadly not. Now, along those lines, let's jump back to history momentarily. We have recently, in the past, exited, suddenly it doesn't feel so far in the past, a long 50-year approximate Cold War between the Soviet Union and mostly the U.S., with NATO pretending to pick up its share of the burden.
Right.
And that basically was a 50-year global proxy war.
Right.
What I find interesting right now is it seems to me that we have a strange shift occurring, and I only first thought about this morning. We have re-engaged in proxy warfare all around the world, but for the first time ever, at least in my opinion, it seems like the proxies are playing the tail wagging the dog game and forcing the big players and the second-tier players like Iran to get involved in these skirmishes all around the world. And I use the tail wagging the dog thing because it makes you wonder, was this on purpose? Was it an accident? Was it a way, if you're the Russian clients, for example, in the eastern provinces of Ukraine, could this be seen as something you might do and then say, oh, it's an accident, or trying to make it look like Russia is in there? And of course, that leads to, I want to get your opinion on that. I want to tie one thing to that. Colonel Ralph Peters made a very interesting comment, which is to say he does not believe that the Russians would have put, he has no reason to believe that they have put in the hands of the separatists the equipment that could actually take a cruise altitude plane like a 777 out of the sky, which makes it start to look like perhaps the Russians actually did this, even if it was a mistake. So it could be the tail wagging the dog, but it could also be somebody pretending the tail's wagging the dog, which really complicates things, from my perspective.
Right. Well, I mean, first I'd go back to something you said earlier, and it's to get the adults in the room to actually have a meaningful conversation. But I would add that there's always a possibility for the adults in the room to be evil, and so there could be a very deliberate. This could be a very deliberate, step in a very complicated Byzantine series of steps in order to achieve some other aim, and I think that's perfectly within the realm of the possible with Tsar Putin, and so I would say that in the particular case of Russia and Putin, I have a very hard time thinking he would let the tail wag the dog. He's done that. He's done that drill before, particularly in KGB. The KGB training program was all about making sure that the client states did what the boss wanted them to do and how to manipulate them to make sure that they did that. And so you get back to the same issue, and obviously is the issue, as you say, would the Russians give an SA-17 to the separatists without any kind of oversight? And while it's possible, you just got to believe that there'd be somebody at least sitting there watching things to make sure that they don't do something untoward. And in that regard too is this. Even though an SA-17, which that's what the papers are saying, shot this down, very capable system. Even though an SA-17 has the capability to shoot this airplane down, it's a what's called a semi-active system. So there has to be a radar on the ground illuminating the airplane, transmitting and reflecting off the airplane, and the missile homes in on that reflection. If you will, the beauty of that is that you have about 10 or 12 seconds. If you inadvertently launch a missile, you have about 10 or 12 seconds where you can turn off the illuminator, and that missile will not hit the airplane. So there is a very small but nonetheless very real opportunity. If you had someone sitting there and somehow, they were running a drill, running a test, and the missile leaves the rail, you could say, "Holy cow! Turn off the illuminator," and the missile would go dead. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily anybody's going to be, that sharp enough to figure that out or not, but, you kind of throw that in, and then you say, okay, now I've got this multi-million-dollar system, very capable system. Are you really going to let these guys have control of this thing if you're the Russians? I mean, I would submit the Russians would not. I've got to believe that there's a couple of Russian guys at each one of those facilities, each one of those sites, who's kind of honchoing the damn thing.
You open up a couple possibilities here. We're speaking with Pete O'Brien, who's a retired Navy captain, and he's with the London Center for Policy Research. But the two possibilities that you're opening up are, if indeed those systems are in eastern Ukraine, there's possibility that there are unmarked Russian troops who are operating them. The other possibility is, and just observing some of the reporting of the wreckage, that quite possibly they thought they were taking down another transport like they've already done, and maybe realized at the last minute that it was a commercial airliner, possibly tried to stop the missile and maybe it clipped the plane, which could have led to the type of fall that the plane led to. Just all these possibilities have to be considered. Now, obviously, if a missile is launched, there's only three possibilities here. It came from Russia, the pro-Russian separatists, or the Ukrainians themselves. I think the probability of it being in another European state or the Americans is probably less than zero.
Yeah, I mean, that would make for a great, spy thriller kind of thing. Some kind of twisted, it's the CIA or something like that. But let's face it, that's nonsense. Yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a possibility that it's a fourth party, but that possibility is down in about the 1 in a trillion range. It's just not. If in fact that's going on, there's someone very clever out there, and this is only the tip of the iceberg of what we need to be worried about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to make it clear because as John was introducing a question earlier, he mentioned the black box investigation. I think that both sides, the Ukrainian government out of Kiev and the Eastern Ukrainian DPR, need to allow an international group, a team, to come in and investigate the actual ground wreckage. And I agree with you 100%, Pete O'Brien. There should be a call for an immediate ceasefire. I'd love to see a ceasefire anyway, because I think some of the reporting of the brutality and things that are happening on both sides, I think, are uncalled for and need to be addressed as well. And I don't like to see any of these types of things happening. I think this is too dangerous. It's too hot. This could escalate to things and places that I don't think any of us want to go to. And I think you could tell, as Putin made a call to President Obama this morning and then informed him towards the end of the call about the incident with the plane, based on what knowledge he thought he had at the time, that I don't think either one of these sides wanted to escalate beyond where it's gone to, or Vladimir Putin probably wouldn't have made that call.
Well, unless I don't think that this is beyond the realm of the possible, unless Putin is playing a very clever game of chess.
Well, he is. He's definitely playing a game of chess, and our president's playing pool.
Right.
And I think we're getting beat, to be honest with you. But I mean in terms of, I think he's very concerned about the new sanctions. I think that's exactly what the call is about. And clearly he's trying to de-escalate this to some degree. That's why I make that statement.
Well, right. I mean, I think at least he's playing that card right now. And I think there's an interesting question here is this something? Is this kind of incident something that he may not have anticipated this specific thing, but he anticipated that eventually something was going to get out of whack, some extreme, horrific event, and he would then be able to use that horrific event to essentially, roll back the situation to the level that he wants it to be, and I think that's always a possibility.
Absolutely. Well, Pete O'Brien, I appreciate all the time that you've spent with us today, and I'd love to ask you, as more information comes about and as this situation in the Ukraine unfolds, we'd love to have you back on to pick up this conversation. Happy
to come back to talk to you.
And also, if you can, please, for our listeners, if you could provide the website for the London Center of Policy Research so they can go find out more information.
I don't have it in front of me, but I believe it's simply www.londoncenter.org.
Anyway, Pete O'Brien, first of all, thank you so much for the service that you've given to our nation.
Thank you. We're quite happy to do it.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Have a great afternoon.
Hey, thank you. You too.
All right, take care.